Air travel has always promised safety through routine: gates, baggage checks, and boarding calls. Each step is designed to keep danger out. But when even a single weakness is exploited, that promise collapses. On a winter evening in 1988, families and students boarded a Pan Am 747, expecting nothing more than a quiet holiday flight. 38 minutes later, the jet tore apart in the night sky, scattering wreckage and fire over a small Scottish town. What began as an ordinary journey became the deadliest act of aviation terrorism of its time, and the spark for a reckoning that would change how the entire world flies. Let's go back to a cold December night in 1988. The night began like countless others at London's Heathrow. Holiday lights glowed in the terminal windows. Departure boards flickered with destinations across the Atlantic. In the departure lounge, conversations mixed with the smell of coffee and the shuffle of boarding passes. At gate 14 stood a Boeing 747-121, registration N739PA. Painted with Pan Am's blue globe, it carried the name Clipper Mate of the Seas. On paper, this was Flight 103, London to New York, continuing to Detroit. In reality, it was a homecoming for many who had been away too long. The cockpit crew embodied professionalism. Captain James McQuarrie, 55 years old, had logged nearly 11,000 hours in the air. First Officer Raymond Wagner, at 52, was another veteran with over 12,000 hours, half of those on the jumbo jet. Flight engineer Jerry Averitt, 46, had spent his career between National Airlines and Pan Am. Together, they formed a crew that knew the 747 intimately. The cabin staff were equally seasoned, with careers ranging from 9 months to nearly 3 decades. Their passengers reflected the season. Families bound for Christmas gatherings, business travelers are closing the year, and most poignantly, 35 Syracuse University students are returning from a semester abroad. For them, this was the final chapter of an unforgettable adventure in Europe. Ahead lay parents waiting in snowy driveways, friends ready with holiday plans. Boarding began at 5:25 p.m. Bags slid through conveyor belts. Ticket stubs were torn. By 6:25 p.m., the jumbo jet rolled down Heathrow's runway, heavy with 259 souls and more than 100 tons of fuel. The climb was smooth, the transition to cruise uneventful. Passengers settled into seats, tray tables lowered, movies flickered across screens. A routine Atlantic crossing had begun. Nothing in those first 38 minutes suggested the night would end differently than thousands of flights before it. The system appeared intact. Aircraft sound, crew experienced, weather calm. Yet inside the cargo hold beneath their feet, hidden among ordinary luggage, lay a device built to rupture more than metal. It was designed to shatter routine itself. At 7 GMT, Pan Am 103 reached 31,000 feet as it crossed the English-Scottish border. The engines hummed steadily, pushing the giant airframe westward into the night. Passengers leaned into pillows, crew moved through the aisles, and for a brief moment, the rhythm of flight seemed eternal. Then silence was broken. At 7:50, the cockpit voice recorder captured a sharp metallic crack just before all data vanished. In the forward cargo hold, a bomb concealed in a Toshiba cassette player detonated. Packed inside a Samsonite suitcase, the device contained Semtex, a plastic explosive powerful enough to punch a basketball-sized hole through aluminum skin. The pressure differential at altitude was merciless. A hole became a tear. The tear unzipped the fuselage. In less than 3 seconds, the nose cone separated completely from the rest of the aircraft. The cockpit, still strapped with Captain McQuarrie and his officers, plummeted toward the Scottish countryside. They never had time to touch the radio. No mayday, no warning. The remaining fuselage, now mortally wounded, began to break apart. The tail section was sheared off. Fuel-laden wings disintegrated. Seats, luggage, and bodies were sucked into the freezing slipstream. For the 243 passengers, there was no chance of survival. The forces of decompression exceeded anything the human body could endure. On the ground below, the night sky split open. Debris streaked across the heavens, fiery fragments visible for miles. In the town of Lockerbie, residents heard what some thought was thunder, others an earthquake. Within seconds, it became clear. This was no storm. The remains of Clipper Mate of the Seas fell over 845 square miles of countryside, a scale so vast it would soon be called the world's largest crime scene. Yet in these first terrible moments, all that could be grasped was the enormity of loss. Hundreds of lives extinguished, their final minutes marked by speed, violence, and silence. And as flaming wreckage hurtled earthward, one question would define the hours to come. How could a single suitcase bring down one of the most sophisticated machines ever built? The roar that reached Lockerbie was not the hum of jet engines, but an explosion tearing through the night. At 7:04 p.m., the largest piece of wreckage, the wing still heavy with more than 100 tons of jet fuel, plunged into the neighborhood of Sherwood Crescent. The impact gouged a crater more than 150 feet long and ignited a fireball so intense it incinerated everything in its path. 15 houses vanished in an instant. 11 residents died where they stood, including a family of 4 whose home became the epicenter of the blast. The shock wave registered as a seismic tremor miles away. Across the town, other fragments rained down. A nose section crashed into a hillside near Tundergarth. Seats and bodies landed in gardens. Engines smashed through fields. For the 4,000 people of Lockerbie, their quiet town was transformed into something resembling a battlefield. Within minutes, the Dumfries and Galloway Constabulary, the smallest police force in mainland Britain, took command. Local firefighters battled an inferno that resisted every hose. Ambulance crews searched in vain for survivors. Volunteers rushed from homes, stunned by the sight of luggage strewn across hedgerows and Christmas presents lying in the mud. Amid devastation, small acts of humanity emerged. Residents brought blankets for the dead. Farmers guided emergency workers across fields and tractors. In the days ahead, townspeople would take on a heartbreaking task, washing the personal belongings of victims so they could be returned to grieving families. Stained shirts, scorched toys, charred photographs, all cleaned by strangers who refused to let tragedy erase dignity. What began as chaos soon took on a deeper weight. This was not only a disaster scene, it was becoming clear that it might be something more sinister. For now, though, Lockerbie was a place of loss, fire, and resilience. But as dawn broke and fragments of a Boeing 747 were counted across the hills, investigators realized the true scale of what lay before them. This was not a crash site, it was the world's largest crime scene. By morning, Lockerbie was no longer a town but the center of an investigation spread across 845 square miles. The largest crime scene in history. Fields, rivers, and rooftops were littered with wreckage. Police officers marked evidence with flags that dotted the countryside like confetti, each one a clue in a puzzle too vast to comprehend at first glance. More than 5,000 responders converged: Scottish police, military personnel, volunteers, and soon agents from the FBI. The scale was staggering. Over months, they would recover 319 tons of wreckage, painstakingly transported to hangars, where investigators began an extraordinary task: rebuilding the plane piece by piece. At the Air Accidents Investigation Branch facility in Farnborough, the skeletal frame of Clipper Mate of the Seas slowly took shape. Twisted aluminum was bolted to scaffolding. Shattered panels were arranged like a jigsaw. And in the forward cargo hold, one pattern stood out: metal bent outward, not inward. This was no structural failure, it was an explosion. The realization shifted everything. What many first assumed to be a terrible accident was now suspected to be deliberate. A bomb, a weapon smuggled past airport security. The implications were staggering. If someone could plant an explosive in a checked bag on one of the most heavily trafficked routes in the world, no airline was safe. Yet even with suspicion rising, proof was fragile. Investigators faced terrain scattered with millions of fragments, many no larger than a coin. The challenge was clear. Somewhere in this sea of debris lay the key to who had done it and how. For now, the only certainty was chilling. This was not fate, not weather, not pilot error. It was murder at 31,000 feet, and finding the perpetrators would require detective work on a scale aviation had never seen before. The search for answers began with the smallest of fragments. Among scorched soil and torn clothing, investigators recovered a sliver of green circuit board no larger than a fingernail. It was embedded in a piece of shirt fabric. At first, it looked meaningless, just another shard in millions. But under the microscope, it revealed precision soldering, copper traces, and a clue that would change the course of the inquiry. The fragment was identified as part of an MST-13 electronic timer manufactured by a Swiss firm called MEBO. These timers weren't sold on the open market. They were produced in small numbers and shipped under contract to only a handful of clients, among them Libyan intelligence. But the timer alone wasn't enough. The bomb itself had been concealed inside a Toshiba radio cassette player, packed into a Samsonite suitcase. Around it, the device had been cushioned with ordinary clothing. That clothing became its own line of evidence. Investigators traced a set of garments, trousers, a gray shirt, a child's umbrella back to a small shop in Malta called Mary's House. The shopkeeper, Anthony Gauchi, remembered the purchase clearly. A man with a Libyan accent, buying a random assortment of clothing items in December 1988. It wasn't a typical customer. It felt deliberate, like someone trying to stock a suitcase without leaving a personal trace. This discovery was seismic. A timer fragment from Switzerland, clothes traced to Malta, a suitcase routed through Frankfurt, then transferred at Heathrow onto Pan Am 103. Piece by piece, a map was forming. Yet one question remained: who exactly bought those clothes? Gauchi's memory gave investigators a face. Records gave them a date. And soon, both pointed to a man whose name would become synonymous with Lockerbie. The open loop had narrowed. Behind a single suitcase, investigators were beginning to see a state, a network, and an operative. The man identified was Abdel Basit Ali al-Megrahi, an officer in Libya's intelligence service. He operated under diplomatic cover and had ties to the country's national airline. Immigration records placed him in Malta on the exact day the suspicious clothing was purchased. He had traveled under a false passport. For investigators, this was the missing link. The bomb's path could now be traced with chilling clarity. Packed in Malta, loaded onto Air Malta flight KM-180, transferred to Frankfurt, routed onto Pan Am's feeder flight, and finally placed aboard Flight 103 at Heathrow. At every step, it moved unseen, an unaccompanied bag slipping through cracks in security protocols. The forensic trail was damning. The MST-13 timer connected to Libyan procurement, the Maltese clothing tied to a Libyan buyer, and the chain of baggage transfers showed how the suitcase avoided detection. It was, in essence, the perfect exploitation of routine, a calculated act of state-sponsored terror. On November 15, 1991, after 3 years of joint investigation, the United States and the United Kingdom issued indictments against al-Megrahi and another Libyan operative, Lamin Khalifa Fhimah. The charges: 270 counts of murder. Libya refused to hand them over. Colonel Muammar Gaddafi's government dismissed the accusations as politically motivated. Diplomacy stalled, and the world watched as sanctions tightened. No country could ignore the implications. If a sovereign state had ordered the destruction of a civilian airliner, then international travel itself had become a battlefield. Families of the victims were left waiting, years passing without a trial, justice suspended by geopolitics. But the evidence was clear enough to lock the investigation into history as one of the most meticulous manhunts ever undertaken. For the townspeople of Lockerbie, for the students of Syracuse, for the hundreds of families still grieving, the name al-Megrahi now carried the weight of accountability. Yet conviction was still far away. The road to justice would take nearly a decade and would unfold not in Libya, nor in the US or UK, but in an unusual courtroom on neutral soil. The indictments of Abdel Basit al-Megrahi and Lamin Khalifa Fhimah in 1991 created an impasse. Libya refused to extradite its agents. The US and UK refused to hold the trial on Libyan soil. For nearly a decade, diplomacy ground to a halt. In the meantime, United Nations sanctions tightened. Libya was barred from air travel, arms sales, and much of the global economy. The victims' families waited, trapped in a holding pattern of grief without closure. It took a bold compromise to break the deadlock. Legal scholars and diplomats devised an unprecedented solution. The suspects would be tried under Scottish law, but on neutral ground. A former US military base at Kamp van Zeist in the Netherlands was transformed into a special high-security court. Judges, not a jury, would weigh the evidence. For the first time in modern history, International justice adapted itself to fit the scale of an act of terror. In 1999, after years of standoff, Gaddafi agreed to surrender the two suspects. The trial opened in May 2000 and lasted 8 months. Testimony came from 235 witnesses, tracing every fragment of evidence, from the Swiss timer to the Maltese clothing to the suitcase transfers in Frankfurt and London. On January 31, 2001, the verdict was delivered. Al-Megrahi was convicted of 270 counts of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. His co-accused Fima was acquitted for lack of evidence. The split verdict raised questions, but offered at last a measure of justice. Libya itself would eventually yield to international pressure. In 2003, Gaddafi formally accepted responsibility for the bombing, not personally, but on behalf of the state. Libya paid nearly $3 billion in compensation to the victims' families, money delivered in installments that doubled as bargaining chips for the lifting of sanctions. For the families, the conviction and the compensation were bittersweet. They proved that accountability could reach across borders, but they also left lingering doubts. Had one man truly acted alone, or was the full story still obscured by politics? Even as al-Megrahi sat in a Scottish prison cell, not everyone accepted the official narrative. From the start, alternative theories had circulated, each shaped by the politics of the late 1980s. The most prominent was the Iran retaliation theory. In July 1988, just months before Lockerbie, the U.S. Navy had mistakenly shot down Iran Air Flight 655, killing 290 civilians. Intelligence reports suggested Iran had sought revenge, paying $10 million to a Palestinian militant group, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, General Command PFLP-GC. German police raids in October 1988 uncovered PFLP-GC members with bombs hidden inside Toshiba radios, the same model later linked to Pan Am 103. The parallels were striking, but forensic detail unraveled the theory. The timers recovered in Germany were crude, improvised devices, nothing like the sophisticated MST-13 timer traced to Libya. Worse, the bomb maker, Marwan Krisat, was discovered to be a double agent for Jordanian intelligence, instructed to build devices that wouldn't actually detonate. Another claim pointed to a CIA-linked drug smuggling route. The idea was that Syrian traffickers swapped a suitcase of narcotics for one containing the bomb, bypassing security with agency protection. But this account relied on a single private investigation firm and a key witness later convicted of perjury. U.S. courts dismissed the theory outright. Still, doubt lingered. Families like Dr. Jim Swire, who lost his daughter on Flight 103, argued the case against Libya was incomplete. Journalists continued to explore inconsistencies in witness statements and the political utility of blaming Gaddafi's regime. The persistence of these theories reflected more than just disputed evidence. They spoke to a broader truth. In moments of mass tragedy, trust in governments and intelligence services fractures easily. When verdicts leave gray areas, conspiracy fills the space. In the end, the judges at Kamp van Zeist themselves admitted the case was not watertight. They convicted al-Megrahi, but noted uncertainties in testimony and motive. That acknowledgement became fuel for decades of suspicion. Lockerbie was therefore not just a case about one bomb. It was also a test of how much faith the public could place in the official story and whether truth could ever be separated from politics. Before Lockerbie, flying was almost casual. Passengers could arrive half an hour before departure. Families could walk freely to the gate without a ticket. Carry-on bags passed through basic X-ray machines, while checked luggage was rarely screened at all. Security was built to catch guns and knives, not explosives. Pan Am 103 exposed the fatal flaw. The bomb was an unaccompanied bag, a suitcase that traveled without its owner, transferred across airports without scrutiny, and slipped past every safeguard. After the wreckage, investigators reported that the system had been held together only by luck. The scale of the disaster forced governments to act. In August 1989, President George H.W. Bush established the President's Commission on Aviation Security and Terrorism. Its report, released in May 1990, was scathing. It concluded that the bombing may well have been preventable had proper baggage reconciliation and explosive detection systems been in place. Congress responded with the Aviation Security Improvement Act of 1990. It mandated 100% baggage screening, investment in explosive detection technologies, and tougher international standards. Airports were required to match every checked bag to a confirmed passenger. The law became, in Bush's words, a living memorial to the victims. But progress was uneven. By 1994, the Government Accountability Office found that the FAA had made little progress in deploying detection systems. Implementation lagged behind urgency. In truth, the full impact of Lockerbie's lessons would not be realized until after September 11, 2001, when the TSA was created and advanced screening became universal. Still, Lockerbie shifted the paradigm. Security stopped being about hijackers with guns and became about explosives hidden in bags. The industry's blind spot had been exposed. For Pan Am, however, the shift came too late. The airline had already been weakened by deregulation, debt, and mismanagement. Lockerbie shattered public trust. Bookings collapsed. Lawsuits mounted with damages reaching $300 million. By January 1991, Pan Am filed for bankruptcy. By December, the once iconic globe logo disappeared from the skies. The human cost of Lockerbie was measured in lives. The corporate cost was measured in the fall of one of aviation's most storied names. For the families of Pan Am 103, grief turned into action. In February 1989, just 2 months after the bombing, they formed Victims of Pan Am Flight 103. They lobbied Congress, testified in hearings, and pressed relentlessly for stronger aviation security. Their advocacy directly shaped the President's Commission and the reforms that followed. The memory of the 35 Syracuse University students became a lasting call to remembrance. On campus, the place of remembrance was dedicated in 1990, engraved with their names. Each year, 35 seniors are chosen as remembrance scholars, tasked with carrying forward the stories of those who never returned. The program ensures that every generation learns what was lost and why vigilance matters. In Scotland, Lockerbie built its own quiet memorials. At Drivesdale Cemetery, a garden of remembrance offers sanctuary. A stained glass window in the town hall filters light in their memory. And at Arlington National Cemetery in the U.S., a cairn built from 270 stones donated by Scotland, one for each victim, stands as a permanent transatlantic bond. Even decades later, the pursuit of justice has not ended. In 2020, U.S. prosecutors unsealed charges against a third suspect, Abu Aghala Massoud, alleged to have built the bomb. In 2022, he was taken into American custody. His trial is scheduled for 2026, proof that Lockerbie remains an unfinished story. Yet legacy is measured not only in courts or commissions, but in the quiet persistence of memory. Families cleaning scorched belongings in Lockerbie, students carrying scholarships in Syracuse, policymakers invoking Lockerbie each time they debate security. December 21, 1988, was not just the night an aircraft fell from the sky. It was the night aviation itself was forced to reckon with vulnerability. The reforms that followed created the foundation of the security world we live with today. An inconvenience at the airport counter, but a system built on lives lost. One flight, one suitcase, one winter night over Scotland. That was enough to change how the entire world flies, and to remind us that the safety of millions can depend on the smallest of overlooked weaknesses. The story of Pan Am 103 reminds us that every safety measure we pass through at airports today was bought with lives lost decades ago. It's a legacy written in vigilance, in reform, and in remembrance. If this story helped you see aviation in a new light, there's more to uncover. Subscribe, like, and share so these stories and the people behind them are never forgotten.